This is episode number 153 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Joining me today is Mary Sheldon. This is her third time on the podcast, as she was my guest for episodes 81 and 119. Rosemary taught history as a professor at Virginia Military Institute for more than 25 years and is a world-renowned expert on intelligence activities in the ancient world. She earned her PhD from the University of Michigan in 1987 and has published several books and many articles over the years, as well as serving as an editor for the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence in Small Wars and Insurgencies and the Journal of Military History. I invited Rosemary onto the podcast again after reading her book, Guarding the Caesars. It's a continuation of her previous work, this time covering the lives and deaths of the emperors of the Flavian dynasty, who came after the Julio-Claudian emperors we discussed last time, along with the internal security measures they put in place to protect themselves, with varying degrees of success. But before we get into this story, I want to tell you about a tool you're not going to want to miss. It's the Gray Man Briefing Classified. By now, I think I know my listeners pretty well, and take it from me, this briefing is exactly the news and educational reference source that you've been looking for. You'll get breaking news updates from all over the world on topics including planned protests and riots, low-intensity conflicts, natural disaster alerts, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions, and more. You'll also get access to articles that help you build your own skills, including urban survival, home security, counter-surveillance, escape and evasion techniques, and more. And this is much more than just a newsletter in your inbox. Joining the Gray Man Briefing Classified also includes invitation-only channels on the Telegram and Signal apps for convenient real-time updates. The newsletter subscription is normally $5 per month, but if you use the code GBC Spycraft, you can save 20% each month for the life of your subscription. I'm already a member myself and have been reading and learning a lot since I first subscribed. Look it up yourself at graymanbriefing.com. That's gray with an A, graymanbriefing.com. And use the discount code GBC Spycraft to save 20% right from the start. Rosemary, thank you for joining me again today.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be back.
I'm glad to hear that. I know that we have just barely scratched the surface of so many centuries of history last time around, and so I'm excited to revisit this topic from a new angle this time around.
Yes, last time we covered the 100 years of the Julio-Claudians. Today we only have to cover 27 years of the Flavians, so we can breeze through this in no time.
Yeah, they burned hot and bright and for a short period of time, it seems like. So, since you mentioned it's a shorter period of time, was this a subject that's a little bit more difficult for you or others to research compared to the Julio-Claudians, for example?
I thought, gee, I only have 3 emperors. How much material could there be? And then I found that there was much, and some of it, though, is not very good. There are actually fewer sources on the Flavians than there are on the Julio-Claudians. Suetonius does have them in the lives of the 12 emperors. They are the last 3, but there isn't a lot of detail. Another problem is Titus only reigned for 2 years, so there's not much to say about him except what we know during that time period. And then Domitian is one of the most controversial emperors who ever lived, and so he suffered what we call damnatio memoriae. His memory was damned after he died. The inscriptions with his name on it were erased. And the controversy in the modern sources is amazing. His name has been so blackened, I'm not sure we can ever recover the real Domitian.
Oh, that's a shame. I think that's very common with a lot of the subjects that I end up talking about, though, is how much more is there that we don't know and may never know. It's unfortunate. Rosemary, can you tell me, it was only 3? Were these 3 emperors, were they all related? Was this a familial dynasty or is it something else?
Yes, Vespasian is known as the founder of the Second Roman Empire. If the Julio-Claudians were a package deal, people who were related to each other in a dynasty that was inherited. When the last one died, Nero, there were no relatives to in any way take over. There were aristocrats who would like to have the job, but it was a free-for-all. And so the year of the 4 emperors, AD 69, is an absolute mess. You have an emperor killed every 3 months. There were 4 of them. That's why it's called the year of the 4 emperors. The first 3, most people haven't heard of, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. And then when Vitellius dies, it's Vespasian who takes over. And he is the one who brings a stable empire back.
Hmm.
And one of the problems with the instability is there is no way to legally pass on the prince of it. You can say, well, I'd like my sons to inherit, but that's not really legal. It's not written down. There's no constitution. And so Vespasian says, I'm going to establish this fact. I have two sons. They are going to succeed me, and either they succeed or nobody does.
Hmm.
So he's founding a dynasty. He has two heirs. He is a fantastic soldier. He has been immensely successful with his army, so he can both control the empire. He can take there isn't a throne, but we'll say, the seat of power. And he can take the Augustan template and basically use it. He doesn't have to invent anything new. He just has to use the old machinery that Augustus set up, use it well, and of course, rule number one, keep yourself alive.
Right, right, of course. So on that note, the three that preceded him so rapidly, was this just a matter of like the plots continually succeeded? Because as we've talked about before, there were always plots against these guys, and most simply did not succeed. I mean, why is it that this one particular year saw four emperors? Just an anomaly of some sort?
The question is who's going to take over and how. When Nero died, his successor, Galba, was ruling over, he was a governor of the province in Spain, is far, far away. He can declare himself emperor, but then you have to get to Rome and you have to defeat other armies and then you have to take over the city and you have to have people believe that you're the emperor. You have to have people loyal to you. He hadn't been in Rome for 10 years. He didn't know anybody.
Mm.
And in fact, his own Praetorian prefect makes a move on the throne to get rid of him, take over. And so it's one thing to declare yourself emperor, it's something else to have other people believe it. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius were all pretty much people who were not in control ever. They tried to be, they declared themselves, so that they got there, they got as close as Rome, and they did various things, but none of them really had a firm grip on the security system. And so they died.
Yeah, as happened to everybody eventually. Rosemary, I have to ask almost a little bit of an aside, but why did the Praetorians stay as such a powerful organization when they were involved in pretty much every assassination, as you've mentioned in the past two discussions on this topic? I mean, I can't believe that at some point they weren't, dissolved in some way or weakened, by an incoming emperor, perhaps. Is that just a crazy thought of mine?
No, Augustus set up the Praetorian Guard. The very first person he appointed quit in 2 months and said, no, I'm not doing this. He saw the problems that you're caught between the emperor, in theory, on paper. You have a Praetorian prefect, and then you have 9,000 soldiers. And their job is to guard the palace and the emperor when he travels, and they could also be used in warfare. They have units that could fight around the emperor. Later, they put in two prefects. They said, well, if you can't trust one, if you have two, maybe they'll play off each other. The only ones that really come into play around the palace are the two prefects. They're the ones that can go with the emperor or against the emperor.
Hmm.
They may use a couple of soldiers, as the dagger man. And very rarely is a Praetorian soldier a dagger man. It's happened, but it's not every one. You can use almost anyone in the palace to kill the emperor, as it's going to happen with Domitian. You've got slaves and freedmen and people working around. All you need is somebody with a grudge and say, okay, we're going to hire you. This is how we're going to do it. Go stab him. And that's it. It doesn't have to be a soldier or anybody trained in the army. If the Praetorian leaders go one way or the other, it's political, because emperors are not killed by the army. They're not killed by the people. They're not killed by mobs. There are no revolutions. These are all palace conspiracies. You're killed by somebody who wants your job. And that person must have around him some senators, because the Senate has to go along with it. The Praetorian prefect or two have to say, okay, I'll bring the guard along with me. In other words, you cover all bases, and you have to have a successor in mind. You must have in that conspiracy the guy who, as soon as the emperor is dead, is going to sit on the throne and say, "Long live the emperor, it's me." These things don't happen accidentally. You can read
Hmm.
Suetonius, and as we spoke about last time, Claudius is found drooling behind the curtain and by the Praetorian Guard and brought out and made emperor. It's a story. It's a
Hmm.
story. He was in on it. You have to be in on it because these kinds of overthrowing of a person in power that involves planning. It has to be a small knit group of people who are in the know. You can't have the word get out, or somebody will turn you in. You have to have access to the emperor, and there's so very few people who have that. The timing has to be right. Where's the emperor going to be? And then you have to have somebody willing to kill him, and that seems to be the easiest thing to find.
Okay.
It's all the other planning that is a problem.
I see. I see. If I might be misremembering here, but it seems like there were many conspiracies kind of through all echelons of society, but just many of them had no chance of succeeding because of those concentric rings of security and privacy and everything, as you mentioned earlier, right? It
Well,
was,
that's right. If a threat came from the outside, the emperor has his Praetorian Guard, 9,000 people guarding you. We'll
Mhm.
do a good job. Nobody ever rushed the palace. Nobody ever broke through the gates and came. This is not the French Revolution. This is not the Russian Revolution. It's a whole different
Mhm.
idea. And it's based on fact, one fact alone. As I mentioned, there is no legal way to pass on the principle. So if anybody can be the emperor, then anyone will try
Sure.
to get that job. There's always somebody who will make that leap.
Hmm.
Even under Galba, when his Praetorian prefect Nymphidius Sabinus made a move on the throne, people were saying, "How can a Praetorian prefect be emperor? He's not from a high enough social class." Well, only if you succeed, you make the new president.
Okay, I see. I see. So you did mention in the book these urban cohorts. Can you tell me what those were exactly?
Right. Under Augustus, what I called in the previous book the Augustan system, he knows that as emperor, and with all of these provinces to rule over, the ring around the Mediterranean, he needs all kinds of security people. The Praetorian Guard guards the palace, but they're not a bodyguard. For the bodyguard, he has German soldiers that are literally the person around your person to keep you from being stabbed. Urban cohorts are exactly as the name would suggest urban police. They police the city of Rome because you don't want to have a riot. Any kind of uprising in this city could be a threat to the emperor, and so it's the urban cohort's job to guard the city and make sure that doesn't happen. Then he points the Wigiles, who are the fire brigade, and that doesn't sound like it has anything to do with intelligence or security, but because they're spread throughout the city, Tiberius, for example, used them to arrest Sejanus because he didn't trust the Praetorian Guard, because Sejanus was the Praetorian prefect. And so he took the nearest available group of people organized on a military basis, and they were the Wigiles, and he used them to march to the palace and arrest Sejanus.
Hmm.
And so all of these institutions do some kind of separate security operations. I wish we had more information about the internal structure of them all, or did they coordinate with each other? They must have, but they all reported to the emperor.
Okay. Okay, I see. So we were talking briefly about the four emperors in a year, the year of four emperors. I mean, was this like a very, very chaotic time for the empire as a whole, or was this sort of like machinations in the capital that didn't have a wider effect on people spread out in the far flung reaches?
Anytime somebody is not securely on the throne, then there's chaos elsewhere. It would be an excellent opportunity
Sure.
for somebody to rise up. Some of these people had the backing of certain governors in provinces that had armies. Other people had governors in provinces with armies working against them. So, because there's a governor in every province, those people have their eye on the throne too,
Hmm.
because if they back someone who becomes the next emperor, their stock goes up in price. But if they're caught on the wrong side of a conspiracy, then they lose their position. And it's not unusual for governors to quote unquote disappear from the historical record, which means they were probably assassinated.
Hmm.
The emperor also had spies called delatores who, made these were not backstreet snitches. These are senators. These are senators who, have connections and know things, have their own private intelligence networks. And so if they know something that's being aimed at removing the emperor and they tell the emperor, they're a hero. If they snitch on you, of course, they're horrible people and should be killed immediately. And it's not unusual that when, for example, Titus, who's considered, a good emperor, when he came to the throne, he first thing he said, he was going to call back all the people who had been exiled. He would not have any treason trials. He would not have any senators put to death. And the fact that that makes him popular tells you what was being done before.
Right.
One of the things that will get you killed, if a senator plots against you, that's treason. And you have every right in the world to have him executed. But how many times can you do that before the next round of senators are going, we may be next. Maybe we should get rid of him first.
Yeah, very understandable.
And that's the conundrum, because you can't let people just have conspiracies for the fun of it. You do have the right to keep yourself alive. But the question is, what do you do to the senator? Do you exile him? Do you have him have a public trial? Do you let him commit suicide quietly? It's not an easy job being emperor.
Right. That was my next question, honestly, is what was it about the Roman Empire, you think, compared to basically so many other civilizations, that practically all of their leaders died violently, essentially? I mean, we've had violent overthrows elsewhere, but not nearly to the extent as occurred in the Roman Empire. So what was it exactly that led to so many of them dying violently?
Well, the Romans had the highest rate of assassination of any monarchy in the world, anytime, any place. 75% of them were executed, and that is very high. I'm happy to say that some other historian did the math to find out, why that's true. And I mean, you can count them and you can say 75%, but then you need the analysis. One I've already mentioned, and that is that anybody can become emperor. So it's not hereditary. You can say, I'm going to make my son the next emperor and make motions to do that. But legally, nobody has to pay attention to it. So when you don't have an hereditary principle, if anybody can be emperor, anybody will try. There is also no religious belief connected to the emperor. It's not like the Chinese, where you have the mandate of heaven and you have all of these religious rituals that go on with being emperor. Roman emperor is just a guy, and you can build a temple to him after he's dead and pay tribute to his family and say he was good, or you can condemn him and say he was bad. But it's not really a religious position. He's not the Pope. And so there is no stability like that. It's really the principle of succession that nobody ever solved. How you do it smoothly. I think it's telling that after Domitian is killed, the next 5 emperors, who are referred to as the good emperors, the 5 good emperors, were all adopted. That tells you right there that, maybe giving birth to idiot sons or, crazy people is not the way to do it. You can't guarantee quality that way. But you can do it if you adopt an adult who's already in the military and who wants the job and who is respected by other members of the government.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is that you need both a principle, if it's going to be hereditary or whatever means, to spell out how this is going to happen. And that was never done.
Okay.
And then Roman emperor, I mean, it's a very powerful position, and power is exceedingly attractive. People want it, people will kill for it. It always comes down to Michael Corleone's quote: if anything in this life is certain, if history has taught us anything, it's that you can kill anyone. And so if you can get the position by killing the previous emperor, somebody will do it. Somebody will do it.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that answers that really well. So the 3 Flavian emperors were Vespasian and Titus and Domitian. So what was Vespasian's legacy? How did he set the dynasty apart from the Julio-Claudians, for example?
He was very good at what he did. Remember, it was a man of very humble beginnings. He didn't have any pretensions. He knew He wasn't descended from the gods. He didn't take on heirs. He just knew he had a job to do. And he did it well. Your job as emperor, you keep the peace, you balance the budget, you control dissidents, you pay tribute to the old gods and practices, and then if there are any conspiracies against you, you put them down. And that's what he did. Vespasian died with his boots on. He knew that he was going to be deified upon his death if he did a good job. And so when he was dying, he insisted that they make him stand up. And as he was keeling over, he said, I think I'm becoming a
Oh my
god.
gosh! Wow.
He had a great sense of humor. One of my favorite stories about Vespasian is he put a tax on toilets, not like a pay toilet, but the people who came to collect the urine, the tanners who used urine to tan
Hmm.
leather, would come and collect it from the public urinals. And so he put a tax on it. Titus thought this was just outre. How could you do that? And Vespasian reached into his pocket, pulled out a denarius, put it under his son's nose, and says, "Does it smell any different?" In other words, money's money. Don't.
Wow.
Those are the kinds of things. And he walked through the public gardens, spoke to people. Almost anybody could approach him, which must be a security nightmare for anybody guarding him. It reminds me of Mayor Koch in New York. He'd walk around the street and go, "Hey, hi, how am I doing?" And that was the way Vespasian was. There was not a lot of secrecy and not a lot of levels of security, just the usual. But he seemed approachable. And so, when he died, he had done his job. There was money in the till. There was peace in the empire. He died with his boots
Well,
on.
that's about the best you can say of any world leader, honestly, I would think.
Right. And Titus succeeded him with no problem. So he solved that one problem the empire
Hmm.
had.
It's amazing, actually, now that I think about it. And he had been setting up Titus for quite some time before that, right?
Yes, he basically had Titus as a co-emperor. When Vespasian moved on the capital to end the civil war, he put Titus in charge of the Jewish wars. So and he was a commander of great reputation and did his job. And then when he came back to Rome, he too they had a double triumph, one of the biggest ones Rome had ever had. And so they had control of the army, and not surprisingly, Vespasian made Titus his praetorian
Hmm.
prefect. The one position where you have to trust that person, and not two of them, one of them.
Hmm.
He made Titus. And Titus earned a rather brutal reputation in that position. That, in other words, if you made a move on his father, you were going to die. And you were going to die quickly. There's only one really big conspiracy in his reign, and we don't know much about it. There are two people, Appius Marcellus and Caecina Aelianus, who were senators and had been allies of Vespasian. But Titus seemed to think they were going to make a move on his father, invited one of them to dinner, and had him stabbed right there.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, the other one was killed before he could even be tried. So, in other words, he understood security and they didn't fool around.
Hmm. Yeah, clearly. So when Titus ascended then to the seat of power, as you called it, he exceeded his father in some ways, didn't he? And his father had already kind of set a high bar, in my opinion.
Yes, and I assume that Titus would have continued along that route. He would have, again, paid tribute to the old gods. 6 months later, he puts up the first temple to his father, and then when he dies, it becomes the temple of Vespasian and Titus. He kept the peace. He balanced the budget. Through any dissidents, we don't know. He only lived for 2 years, and the only problem he had was he had a Jewish mistress named Berenice. There's supposed to be, a great love story going, but the Roman public would not accept it because Eastern queens always reminded them of Cleopatra, and that didn't end well. And so once he became emperor, he sent her back to Jerusalem. There's no question about it. He was going to do what he had to do. And he was too busy to get in trouble. He had the misfortune to be alive when Vesuvius goes off in August of 79, the Great Fire in Rome in 80, and a plague breaks out in 80. And he was so busy organizing the relief for all of these things and then he dies. He finishes the Flavian amphitheater, the great Colosseum, and dies.
Wow. Well, was this a
Whether
yeah.
it's a natural cause, we don't know. But
That was going to be my next question. I'm assuming that there's some rumors or theories at the very least that it was some sort of conspiracy involved.
the ancient sources give us, three different versions of it. Some say he died a natural death. Some say he was killed by Domitian. Always thought it was incredibly suspicious that both Vespasian and Titus die in the same place of the same
Hmm.
symptoms. And nobody's ever said, was Domitian behind both of those? But it could be
Wow.
coincidence.
Wow.
There's a famous scene at the opening of the Colosseum where Titus is in the royal box, and he cries, and we don't know why. And people have guessed that did he know he was dying? Then he was just crying because he was dying. Did he cry because, damn, I should have had my brother killed before this? Now he's going to succeed, and then there's going to be a mess. We just don't know. It's one of those open questions.
Wow. Yeah, that's very intriguing and tantalizing to think that, he killed his father and his brother and successfully took the seat of power, as you mentioned. But that's also the kind of thing that I can see how it would get wings, even if it's not based in any kind of fact or anything like that.
Exactly, because everybody says bad things about Domitian. Domitian was executed, and therefore, the people who did it are not going to write a history showing how good Domitian was. They're going to blacken his name and show that he had to be killed because he was crazy. They did the same thing with Nero, they did the same thing with Caligula. That insanity is a good way to destroy somebody's reputation and name. He was unstable, and we had to take him out.
I see. So is it safe to say then that you don't trust a lot of the historical narrative on Domitian's rule and his end? Then would that be correct?
Well, I think any professional historian would tell you they don't trust any of the sources on anything. They're only as good as, can you get a second opinion or third opinion? Does anybody in the ancient world agree on anything? You have what you have, and we have so little that sometimes we wind up holding on to the salacious stories of Suetonius because we don't have anything
Hmm.
else. And so we have to say, well, this is what they say. Another example with Titus is most of the Roman sources say he was a wonderful emperor and he did such a wonderful job. Don't look at the Jewish sources. This is the man who helped destroy the temple in Jerusalem.
Hmm.
They can say no good things about him. And, they say that he died because a bug got in his ear and ate his brain out. And it's like wishful thinking, things they would have liked to have happened to the man who burnt down the temple. But they had no sources. So,
Yeah, it's not easy being a historian, is it?
no, no, it
Oh
is
man,
not.
yeah, I've gotten a glimpse of that myself, and I'm sure that you deal with it. You've been dealing with it a lot longer than I have, certainly. So, can you tell us then what has been written about Domitian then, because he's clearly a very controversial figure?
If we could reach deep down into the sources and try to capture a little germ of what he may have been like, we know who his father was, we know who his brother was. There's 11 years difference between Titus and Domitian. Titus was raised at court, Domitian was not. As Domitian was growing up, his brother was off fighting wars. So, they weren't close, but that doesn't mean that Domitian was jealous of him, wanted to kill him or to take the throne. Two, both, I think, Vespasian and Titus had very outgoing personalities, very, very, charming people and enjoyed other people's company. Domitian was an introvert. I don't think he trusted people. This was a man who, when he had his own private palace built, he had the marble polished very highly so that when he was walking through the corridors, he could see reflections to find out who was
Hmm.
behind him.
Marble.
That's not a man that trusts people very
Right.
easily.
Right.
He certainly raised well, had a good education. He did well in the military, although they would never give him credit for it. He had a rather mordant sense of humor. The Senate never really accepted him. After all, there's a faction of the Senate that doesn't want it to be an inherited position. Even when he proved himself, they gave him no credit. And there were real conspiracies against him. So we don't know. Did he kill them for revenge? Did he kill them to keep himself safe? Did it make him a little paranoid? I would think it would. His biggest mistake was killing all of his heirs. It gave any assassin an opening because if he has no heirs, that's when you want to
Yeah.
kill
Yeah.
him. But a lot of conspiracies came from his
Hmm.
family. or he thought they did anyway. And so once he's kind of standing out there on the cliff alone, that was the time when they decided to make their move.
So how did that coup play out exactly?
Well, that always has to do with senators and a successor. The
Of course.
successor was Nerva, the person who becomes emperor immediately. A lot of people around the palace didn't like him, so they got him into a room. There's evidently a private room off the reception room where if you're going to read secret correspondence, that's where you go. And so he's told there's a very, important letter coming, and you need security. So he goes into the room, and the servant who delivers the letter hands him the letter with one hand and then pulls out a dagger and stabs him in the
Oh, man.
groin with the
Oh, my
other.
gosh.
And there were people around the palace who didn't like him. And so they had the Grand Chamberlain kind of organize who would be where in the palace to keep the security guards away from the emperor, which is the wrong thing on the emperor's part. If you're going to have a bodyguard, they should always be with you. He tried to go into his bedroom, reach under a pillow, and get a knife to defend himself, and the knife was gone. The dagger had been removed. So you
Oh,
see,
man.
they planned it well. And then
Mhm.
all the people immediately close to this plot were killed on sight. So it's the Jack Ruby factor that if you kill the killers, nobody can
I
talk.
see. I see.
There's at least one of the Praetorian prefects was involved, if not both. It can't be the people in the palace. These freedmen and slaves in the palace are not going to become the next emperor. And if you revolt as a servant against the emperor, you're going to be killed immediately. So somebody must have convinced them either, "Well, we're going to give you a great deal of money to do this, or we can get you out of the palace and save you and set you up somewhere," for them to think that this would be a good idea. And so, the emperor is killed, and the successor immediately works in there. And my book has a lot of discussion of who in the immediate succession gets big positions. In other words, who gets to be the next Praetorian Guard, who gets to be the next consul, all the plum positions that you would like went to people, and they all seem to belong to a faction. And it's the same faction where the next emperor comes up because Nerva was old and weak. The Praetorian Guard itself, the actual men, revolted. They wanted the assassins handed over because it gives them a bad name. It was their job to guard him, and they wanted to have the people responsible tried. So a year later, Nerva had to do that. But Nerva was old and in bad health,
Hmm.
and so he was told to adopt his successor, and he adopts Trajan. And Trajan is from the group of up and coming governors who would become senators, and later he would become emperor. And he would adopt his successor, Hadrian, and Hadrian would adopt his successor, and so on and so forth. So you always ask yourself, even if you can't prove who did it, you can ask who benefited
Sure.
from it.
Sure. Makes sense. I think I said this in our last discussion, Rosemary, but with the benefit of hindsight, of course, it makes me shake my head and wonder who would want to be emperor after if you're looking back, like the last 6, 7, 8, 9 emperors have all met violent, horrible, surprising deaths from the ones closest to them. And, who would think to themselves, it's going to be different for me. But, there's no shortage of people lusting for power in any society, and certainly not in the empire.
That's right. The person lusting for power is the one who's telling himself, "Oh, I can do a better job.
Right.
I'll be the one. I've got enough, bodyguards to take care of this." No, you don't.
Yep. Never worked out that way, did it?
It never works out that way.
So, other than their demises, which we've mostly talked about, what was the legacy of the Flavian emperors, and how did they change Rome for the better or the worse over their lifetimes?
Well, to go back to Domitian, for all the criticism they did of his foreign policy on the Danube, for example, nothing of his foreign policy was changed. In fact, Trajan just continued it. And so there was an argument that, oh, Domitian bankrupted the empire, but no, there seems to have been plenty of money in the till when Trajan came in. So the question is, we think he did just as good a job. I think that the Flavians all had the same program. Certainly, Domitian is responsible for some of the most famous buildings in Rome. The Piazza Navona is a racetrack. Still there. He built a stadium, for sports and games, temples all over the city. The what we know of as sort of ancient Rome, the most famous buildings are Flavian
Okay,
buildings.
fantastic.
The Colosseum. I mean, it is the symbol of the Roman Empire. I have a whole section in the book on architecture, not the most exciting thing in the world, but that's their legacy. And so when you ask yourself, well, gee, if they did all these wonderful things, why are people still trying to kill them? It's because the people who trying to kill them aren't trying to stop the policy. They're not trying to stop the building program. They're not trying to stop their economic policy. They just want their job.
Hmm. Were the trappings of power so great? Honestly, that was one thing I was wondering about. Did these guys live lives of just absolute luxury? I thought that Rome was pretty well advanced and a fairly high standard of living in many places at the time. I mean,
Oh, Augustus had 13,000 slaves when he died. Can
oh
you
my gosh,
imagine first of all, you have to feed and clothe them. So I don't know, if it's
yeah,
cost benefit analysis is there, but you live in a huge palace or you build yourself a new one. You got the best box at all the performances and at the games. And you wave at everybody and why would anybody want to be president of the United States? When you think about it, not that many of them have been killed, 10% of them, which is low by standards of the
hmm
Roman Emperor. But still, it's no matter what you do, somebody's telling you you're wrong. People are trying to elect you out of office every 4 years. I don't know why anybody wants that kind of power and publicity. Roman emperors, at least they didn't have the media after them. They didn't have to worry about
right,
being slandered by
right,
newspapers.
right.
So you have to have a very thick skin to want to have that kind of power. And maybe there were idealistic ones who thought they could make the empire better. I don't know, but it's this need for popularity, for the people cheering you. It's a certain personality type.
Yeah, it certainly does. Power certainly attracts a very, I wouldn't say a narrow range of people, but a certain type of person, certainly, just over and over again, no question. And that is amazing, despite their short lives. Like Titus, only 2 years reign, but we're still talking about him nearly 2,000 years later. I wonder if they could possibly have imagined that they would be subjects of daily conversations worldwide, nearly 2 millennia later.
Well, two things will get you talked about forever. Number one is being an emperor or a president. And the second thing is the person who killed him, because we're still talking about John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey
Oh, yeah.
Oswald.
Yep, yep,
You see,
sure are.
so sometimes those other famous people, you could be on either end. That position is so powerful and famous that if you kill them, some of the fame spills onto
It
you.
certainly does. It certainly does, no question. So you mentioned the other emperors that came after the adopted ones. Was this a brand new named dynasty that came after the Flavians as well?
Yes, the Antonines are,
Antonine.
are a whole new dynasty. Starts with Trajan, and again, the next five adopt their successors. But of course, the last one, Marcus Aurelius, made the mistake of having a son named Commodus,
Hmm.
and we kind of saw that movie. we know
Yes,
we know how
yeah,
that
yes,
ended.
yes, we do.
So again, if you have a son who knows he's going to become emperor, it's very hard to control them. That you're going to be the most powerful person in the world, and they've been telling you that since you were two. Then that's a problem.
Hmm. Hmm. Understandable. Well, will that be the subject of your next book then, or do you think you're going to move to something else?
If I live long enough, I may, but right now I'm working on two other works. I've just finished a bibliography of ancient intelligence literature because people are always saying, where do you get your information? And so if I put it in a book, then I can just say, go read the book. And the second one is about one of the world's oldest enigmatic cryptograms, if that it indeed that's what it is. That's called the Sator Square. Again, the literature of people guessing what this thing is or where it came from is enormous. So I'm collecting that and writing about the square, and I'm just about to finish that.
Wow. Okay. Fantastic. I was just at the National Cryptographic Museum a couple of weeks ago. As a matter of fact, I don't recall seeing anything about it there, but it sounds like it would certainly be a wonderful fit for that museum.
Well, I published an article for Cryptologia in which I wrote about it, and that's fairly well known. But there's been so much literature since I'm now expanding it into a book. That's how
Okay.
much there is.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to that then.
Should mention that anybody who wants to read these things, I have all my work uploaded on academia.com. You can email me through academia, even if you're not a member. And then, if I get the message, I can always send people a PDF file.
Wow. Okay. Wonderful. Yeah, we will include your email then in the show notes of this episode for anybody that can't easily find it on their own. Then, but that's a great offer of yours. I appreciate it. Very generous because this is just an endlessly fascinating subject for so many people, myself included. And I've read more of your work about the Roman Empire than I have any other authors on that subject. So you are my go-to subject matter expert for certain about this period of time.
Well, that makes me feel like I have a reason for living.
Well, thank you so much, Rosemary. So the book, for those of you who want to read it, is called Guarding the Caesars. It's her third book, I believe. Is that right? Is it your third published book, or you have more?
Now it's my eighth.
Eighth. Wow, I was way off. Okay.
Right. Yeah, we have more interviews to do, more than you even know about.
Wow. Okay, certainly. Fantastic. So Guarding the Caesars is her newest work about the Flavian dynasty. If you want to check it out, it's endlessly fascinating stuff, as I mentioned. And there is so much more that we have not discussed on this episode in this conversation already about the Flavians as well. So make sure that you check that out. You can get it in a wide variety of places, including directly from Rosemary if you'd like. So when do you think your next book will be out? Either of those two? Is one of them coming before the other?
By the end of the year.
Oh, okay. Very soon then. Wonderful. Well, do you have a website or anything, Rosemary? I can't recall if we put it out.
I don't have a website, but as I said, academia.com is where I list all my works. I used to have one when I was teaching, but now I am retired and happily writing, and more books can be turned out.
Terrific. Okay, great. Well, yeah, we'll include your email address with the show notes for anybody who wants to drop you a personal note then.
Thank you. And it's always a pleasure to come back.
All right. Well, thank you, Rosemary. I'm sure I'll be in touch. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram at Spycraft 101. And you can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.